Hi guys, and welcome back to the Early Bird Photo News. I hope you're having a great day. I recently started to post on Twitter a little bit more, so if you're on Twitter, I would really love to connect with you. I'm going to leave a link to my account down there in the description. YouTube recently introduced a feature called Super Thanks, which is a nice way to support creators like me, because under the video now you find a button that says thanks, and you can make a small donation if you find a video fun or really helpful. So if you want to do that, I really appreciate it, but if you don't or you can't, then that's totally fine as well, because I just enjoy talking to you guys and sharing my thoughts with you. Let's talk about the biggest news for this week, and that's definitely the confirmation that we will be seeing the Canon R7 very soon. The 1.6 APS-C crop camera that I know a lot of you bird photographers have been eagerly waiting for. It's likely going to be announced at the end of May, and then it will be available sometime later this year. And the best thing is that we already have some great confirmed specs to look at. It's going to have a 32.5 megapixel sensor, which seems to be the same sensor as from the 90D. It's going to shoot 15 frames in mechanical shutter mode and up to 30 frames in the electronic shutter mode. So it's going to be faster than an R5 and an R6. It's going to have 2 SD card slots, and it will be able to film up to 4K 60p and then 120 frames per second slow motion in 1080p HD. It's also going to be able to have C-Log 3 and in-body image stabilization. So all in all, some pretty compelling stats. What do you guys think? From what I've been reading in the comments, this will be one of those cameras that will bring a lot more people into the mirrorless sector, because they've been waiting for 1.6 crop camera to be able to use some of those shorter lenses, or lens like this 100 to 500 millimeter lens, because with the 1.6 crop factor, that gets you actually to an effective focal length of 800 millimeters on that 100 to 500 millimeter lens. So that will be a really nice and small, lightweight and walk around combo for many people. We haven't heard anything about the autofocus yet, but I would assume it's the same that we have in the R5 and R6 as well, but we'll only have full confirmation later on. But I really don't think that Canon will take out the infamous triple hammer when it comes down to the autofocusing. I don't think it will be as good as the R3, but I definitely see it similar to the R5 or the R6. When it comes to the camera body, I would assume that it's basically the same body as the R6 with a dial on top, which personally I would prefer to see it in the R5 body, but I think the lower spec cameras will most likely share the same body as the R6. Another thing I would have liked to see, but the R6 also doesn't have it, is at least one CF Express Type B card, because it's just much faster. But I suppose 2 SD card slots are fine if you have the smaller sensor with a powerful processor, and it will still be able to clear the buffer fast enough, at least hopefully. Fingers crossed for that, because it's kind of annoying if you had the 30 frames per second, but you're going to hit the buffer after 1 or 2 seconds of shooting. Then it's not as much fun as if you have a large enough buffer that can also sustain that high speed a little bit longer. Talking about those high frame rates, it doesn't seem to be a stacked BSI sensor, so it will likely also share some of those rolling shutter characteristics and kind of wobbly images that the R5 and the R6 have. Though this is something to look out for once we actually test the camera in the field, so I don't expect the perfect performance there when it comes to the rolling shutter, but overall I would expect it to be very good still. The only thing that kind of made me a little bit disappointed in the announcement was that I've been reading at least that it's likely going to have the sensor from the 90D. And that is by no means a bad sensor, but I feel like that sensor didn't have the best ISO performance out there, and I feel like a camera like the R7, it's actually crucial that it has pretty good ISO performance, because a lot of people will use it with a lens like 100 to 500, RF100 to 400, or those f11, 600 and 800 millimeter lenses. And all those lenses share one characteristic, and that is that they are not very wide open. So that means that in the field, especially when it's a little bit darker or cloudy outside, you will have to use high ISO. So it's crucially important for me that the R7 is capable of delivering good image quality at ISO 3200 to 6400, because with those lenses that a lot of people will use on that camera, you will definitely need to have that high ISO performance. And when I heard it's gonna have the 90D sensor, I was a little bit concerned that we might run into trouble, because that sensor definitely starts to tap out around that sort of 3200 ISO range for me personally at least. So it will be interesting to see, maybe with more modern processing, how much Canon will be able to get out of that sensor. But In the end, it is what it is. I still think it's going to be an amazing camera, and I would love to hear from you guys in the comments as well. What do you think about the R7? Are you going to pre-order one? Are you going to order one? Are you looking forward to using one? Or are you going to say, I have an R5, R6, it doesn't really interest me? Let me know in the comments all your thoughts about that camera. And also give me a guess where you think this camera will slot in terms of price. Is it going to be around that $2,000 mark, or is it going to be closer to like an R6? And since we all love talking about gear so much and using gear, Canon also thought, why not announce another camera? So alongside the R7, there will likely be an R10 announced, kind of like the little sister of the R7. And that name actually reminds me of the very old line of cameras that Canon started with, the 10D back in the day. So R10, 10D, that seems to make a lot of sense when it comes to the naming, and might actually suggest that this R10 camera will kind of be the mirrorless version of the current 90D series. The other option could be that the R10 isn't really replacing the 90D, but some of the smaller M-line cameras. So it will actually be interesting to see if that camera will come out in an R6 size body or in something smaller. What would you guys prefer? Kind of the continuation of that 90D series in a mirrorless, like a spec down R7, or would you prefer to see a continuation of that M line as an R10? We also have some confirmed specs to talk about. It's going to have 24 megapixel. The camera will also shoot at 15 frames per second mechanical and 23 frames per second in the electronic shutter mode. So also very fast, and actually faster than the R5 and the R6, and even faster than the R3 in the mechanical shutter mode. And like all of the lower end cameras, it will just have one SD card slot. I don't expect any miracles from the R10. I think it just will be a solid performing entry-level mirrorless camera that will sit well below $2,000. When it comes to video, we haven't really heard anything yet, but I would expect it to be able to do at least 4K 30 frames per second in good quality. I'm not sure if it's going to do 4K 60 frames per second. It would actually make sense to cripple that a little bit and maybe only have 1080p in 60 frames per second to also distinguish it from the R7 a little bit. But all in all, I think also an interesting sounding camera, but I think for most of you bird photographers and wildlife photographers out there, the R7 is the more interesting camera, am I right? And now that you're going to have a new camera soon, you will also need to make sure that you're on top of your game when it comes to image editing. And for that, I would highly recommend that you check out my PROSETS and my masterclass down there in the description. With my PROSETS, I enable you with just one click to transform your RAW files to perfect starting point for the editing process. And then in my masterclass, I teach you step by step all the necessary things that you need to know when it comes to editing your images and make them stand out. So if that's of interest to you, make sure to check that out down there in the description. Alongside the R7 and the R10, Canon is also going to be announcing two EFS lenses that are specifically designed for those crop factor bodies. So one of the lenses will be an 18 to 45mm lens, and the other one will be an 18 to 150mm lens. So two kind of pretty basic standard zoom lenses that are probably part of a kit setup with both of these cameras. And if you're just looking for a cheap, decent standard zoom like an 18 to 45 that becomes a 28 to 70 on a 1.6 crop factor body, I think these lenses could be a good and cheap option, but I wouldn't expect any miracles when it comes to the quality overall. I'm just about to head out to another trip into remote Queensland, and I'm going to take my R3 100 to 500mm lens, both of my R5s, and my brand new RF 600mm lens with me. And hopefully when I come back next week, I will be able to share some more impressions with you. I just like to spend some time with the gear in the field to make sure that everything I say is actually field tested, and I will also be able to show you some great images. I did take the R3 with the 100 to 500mm lens and my RF 600mm lens into the rainforest last week, and that's where the camera for the first time has really surprised me and showed me what it's capable of, because it was very dark, overcast, raining a little bit, so challenging conditions. And the first thing that surprised me was the image stabilization in combination with the RF lenses. With the 100 to 500 and the 600mm lens, this viewfinder is rock solid. By far the best combination of IBIS and image stabilization that I've used amongst any brands. It's also even better than the Z9 and the 100 to 400 that previously was the best for me. Interestingly also for me, it seemed like that the R3 and the R5 have very similar performance on my older EF lens. So the limiting factor actually seems to be the old EF lens. Whereas on the RF lenses, you can see clear performance improvements with the R3 over the R5, especially on that 600mm lens because it has two built-in AF motors. And so the R3 with the bigger battery can power both of these motors, and you see a clear performance improvement over the R5. And another thing I noticed is also that the R3 doesn't seem to get stuck on the background as easily. I must admit that lately I've become a bit of a camera gear shopaholic. And in my video last week, I told you that I've been ordering some tripods, and actually they already arrived. I don't know how B&H in New York does it, but stuff from New York actually arrives quicker in Australia, usually within like 3 days, than me ordering something in Australia just a few kilometers away, which usually takes like a week. Crazy. But let's get down to business and look at my brand new tripod. The tripod I ended up going with is this Pro Media Gear TR344L. I had been browsing around a lot of websites. You gave me a lot of fantastic tips, and I looked at many different tripods, and none of them really excited me, or they weren't available because they're not in stock. And I wanted something now for my next trip. So I ended up looking at that tripod, and when I went to the Pro Media Gear website and looked through the stats, I'm like, wow, this is almost too good to be true. It goes up to 1.8 meters in height. It packs down to 60 centimeters in length for traveling, and it only weighs around 1.8 kilos. So when I read that, I actually got quite excited and thought this sounds like the perfect tripod. And so far, it has quite impressed me. It's nice and light. I really like these legs because they have this nice aluminum at the bottom. So they don't have these rubber legs that come loose like all the Gitzo tripods had. This feels very solid, very well manufactured. So I'm super happy with it for now. It's not the cheapest tripod in the world, and I'll know a lot of you said look for the Leo photo ones, and I looked at them, but I just couldn't find one tripod. Maybe I didn't look hard enough, and some of you will show me now in the comments. But when it came to these specs, I couldn't find any tripod that's this light, this tall, and then still maintains this 60 centimeter length for traveling. So I'm really excited about it, and it's a little bit more expensive. It costs right around the $1,000 mark, but hopefully it will perform in the field, because if it does, this seems to be the ultimate tripod for me. So that wraps up this episode of the Early Bird Photo News. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm gonna go and pack my bags now because I still have to configure my backpacks and my suitcases to be able to take all the gear, and fingers crossed I won't be over the airline weight limit. And what you can do in the meantime is share all your thoughts about the R7, the R10, and all other equipment like the tripod in the comments. Give me a thumbs up for the video and subscribe to my channel, and I will see you guys very soon. And don't forget to add me on Twitter. Bye guys.